Good evening and good morning and also good afternoon, depends where you are. And we have our guests, one in the US, one in Europe. And so thank you for tuning in for our audience here in China and also in other parts of the world. You are watching CCG Special Dialogue, which is the multilateral trading system in global changing context, live from CCG head office. This is actually a part of a 7th annual China and Globalization Forum. And this year, CCG took the initiative to organize the discussion on the recovery of the global economy, trade, and mobility, China-EU economic cooperation, global cooperation, and the China New Development Plan, and also China's international communication. And also we had quite a bit of focus on the China-US relations on the webinar and also on the multilateral trading system. So tonight, this forum is really devoted to our multilateral trading system, but also globalization. So this forum actually achieved a great success. As a matter of fact, we have more than 400 distinguished guests taking part, including nearly 30 ambassadors, and over 50 senior diplomats, country heads of international trade groups and the chambers and the multinationals, represented from international organizations, non-profit and government representatives, and also business leaders, scholars, and experts from academic and think tank community. So it's quite a annual forum that CCG organized. We're very pleased to organize this concluding webinar, which is one of the very important webinar tonight. So we already had a 2 webinar in the previous 2 days. The first online webinar we had was John Thornton. He's the chair emeritus of book institutions and co-chair of Asia Society. And he is also Adam Posen, president of Peterson Institute, and also Ambassador Steve Roy, the former US ambassador to China, and also CCG advisor, the former Vice Minister Wang Huiyao attended our first Sino-US webinar. And then yesterday we had a second webinar, which is focused on also China-US relation. We had the former acting Deputy Secretary of the State Department for Asia, Ms. Susan Thornton, but also with Ronnie Chen, the chair of Asia Society Hong Kong Center. So we are very pleased actually as our final webinar tonight. We have actually thrilled to have 2 distinguished guests to explore the global trade and globalization with us. So we have an honor to have invited Pascal Lamy and Wendy Carter, also a good friend. I'd like to introduce Pascal Lamy. Pascal Lamy is the president of the Paris Peace Forum, which is a very well-known, well-established peace forum in Paris. It's running for, it's getting into its 4th year now. And he's also a coordinator of a Jacques Delors think tank, which includes Paris, Berlin, and Brussels. He was the longest serving WTO Director General so far in the history of WTO, from 2005 to 2013. And between 1999 and 2004, he was the EU Trade Commissioner. And also, he began his career in the French civil service at Inspection Generale de France, the Finance, and also the Treasury. Then he became an advisor to the Finance Minister Jacques Delors, and subsequently to Prime Minister Pierre Mauroy. He served as a chief of staff to the EU President Jacques Delors between 1984 and 1999. So thank you, welcome. Pascal. Pascal also come to CCG Beijing office quite a few times, and I remember as early as 2019, you presented a speech at CCG on WTO reform and the multilateral trading system, and many CCG colleagues and experts from this field from China attended. And last year, you were also spoke at the CCG 6th Annual Forum on China and Globalization, and also gave a very good congratulatory remarks for the CCG Global Young Leaders Dialogue, which launched in last December. I would like also to introduce another well-known speaker tonight, Ms. Wendy Carter is Vice President at Asia Society Policy Institute, and also the Managing Director of its Asia Society in Washington, DC office. And also in those roles, she focused on building SB's presence in the national capital, on leading initiatives that address challenges related to trade, investment, and innovation, as well as women's empowerment as well in Asia. She joined SB following an impressive career of nearly 3 decades as a diplomat and a negotiator in the Office of U.S. Trade Representative, USTR, where she also served as an acting deputy U.S. Trade Representative. During her USTR career, she worked on a range of bilateral, regional, and multilateral trading negotiations and initiatives, including the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership TPP, U.S.-China negotiations, and the WTO financial service negotiations. She has published a series of SB papers on Asian trade and also many other global multilateral trading issues. I also remember hosting Wendy, actually, when you come to CG in January 2018, which is quite a few years ago. And when CG and SB jointly hosted the U.S.-China Economic Relations Roundtable at that time. But also, again, later that year, we actually had joined a breakfast meeting at Washington hosted by SB, and we had a very good discussion between our 2 think tanks. I remember the meeting you hosted in Washington. We had many well-known U.S. experts, including the Kathleen Chai, now the USTR, who also attended the CCG and the SB event in D.C. So it's also, worth mentioning that back April last year, both Wendy and Lamy participated in the CCG webinar, the role of a WTO in global response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So a lot has actually happened, and a lot of has changed then. So let's begin our discussion today. And so maybe I'll start with Wendy. I mean, since you are very familiar with the U.S. government and you were former U.S. government officials, particularly you looked after WTO and the multilateral trading system for quite a long time. So what are the U.S. priorities for the WTO reform and also the actually upcoming 12th Ministerial Conference? Perhaps you could start, and then we have Pascal to start us again.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It's really my honor to be here at another CCG forum, unfortunately virtual. I look forward to doing these in person again. And it's really, I'm humbled to share the virtual stage with Pascal Lamy, who has so much experience and expertise in this area, as well as you, Dr. Wang. So I'm looking forward to a very robust discussion. I thought before I talk a little about how I think the Biden administration is viewing WTO reform, is first just to highlight kind of 3 cornerstones of the Biden administration trade policy, because I think that will help us understand their view on the multilateral approach, as well as on the upcoming WTO ministerial. First, the Biden administration trade policy is very integrated with its domestic agenda. And so issues like COVID recovery, climate change, Build Back Better, all of these initiatives which are being pursued on a domestic basis are also being pursued on an international basis. Second, when it comes to trade policy, the new phrase in Washington is a worker-centric trade policy. I get a lot of questions on what that actually means, so let me share my sense with you, but I would be the first to admit I think it's a work in progress, and that how this policy kind of translates into concrete trade initiatives is still being developed. But what the basis for this policy is really rethinking U.S. trade policy as one that needs to change in order to benefit the working class, the middle class, be responsive to their concerns and priorities, and use trade to really improve not only the number of jobs for US workers, but also to improve the quality of jobs. And again, not just US workers, but workers around the world, and to really use trade, the phrase that Ambassador Tai uses a lot is use trade as a force of good to really uplift the situation and livelihood of workers, as well as to promote more equality among workers, the middle class, et cetera. And the third kind of pillar of the Biden trade policy is to work with allies and partners. We just launched, for example, a Trade and Technology Council with the European Union, which for the purposes of today's discussion includes a working group on global trade challenges. But it also is centered on really being constructive and being engaged in international organizations, multilateral institutions, including the WTO. And so I think all three of these kind of pillars are relevant to today's discussion. And when it comes to the WTO, we did see some early moves by the Biden administration to really show that they're back in the WTO, including very quick endorsement of the new director general, not even waiting for the confirmation of Ambassador Tai. But now we have a new director general at the helm. I'm sure we'll be talking more about Dr. Ngozi. Second, the United States has been very constructively engaged in the WTO agenda. Just last week, for example, we joined the Services Domestic Regulation plurilateral talks. We have been active members of the fish subsidies negotiations. And of course, we are joined ranks with others in calling for a TRIPS waiver for COVID purposes. So I think that gives some indication of how engaged and committed we are. Now, that said, we still have not nominated nor confirmed an ambassador to Geneva, to the WTO. And a lot of our, let's just say, kind of statements on WTO reform have yet to be translated into actual proposals that we've put on the table. But I think that will happen in time. But I also think it's important that when we think about WTO reform and we think about the upcoming ministerial, this can't just be about the United States and what the United States is going to do. And are we conformed? And are we committed? And are we putting proposals on the table? In order for the WTO to move forward and for the ministerial to be successful, this is going to require contributions from all 164 members, as well as the major countries, major trading countries, including the Europe, China, and the United States. And with respect to China, I think that it's going to be important for China to kind of step up here and help move the WTO forward and update its rules. And in particular, I want to highlight the agenda in the WTO with respect to non-market economies. And I think this is an area looking forward where we will need to find a way to work together if the WTO is going to continue to be relevant. And I think there'll be a lot of interest in this agenda as we get closer to the 20th anniversary of China's accession to the WTO, which will take place later this year. Now, I know I've been talking for a long time. Let me just make a few comments then on the MC12, the ministerial conference coming up starting November 30th in Geneva. This will be the first ministerial, if I'm correct, for the WTO in 4 years. It will be the first ministerial that will be led by the new Director General Ngozi. And it's going to be a challenge given where we are with COVID now, particularly if in-person meetings cannot take place in the lead up to the ministerial, and if the ministerial is not an in-person event or a hybrid event. Because I think, as we all know, for concrete outcomes to come out of WTO meetings, in-person meetings, side conversations, talks between smaller groups of countries are really essential. And no matter how great our virtual platforms are, they are limited with respect to in my view, to be able to really negotiate the final issues which allow actual successful negotiations to reach their conclusion. The United States has been, I think, very cautious yet realistic about its objectives for the ministerial meeting. I think partially taking into account where we are with COVID now and the possibility of in-person meetings. But I also think it's important that we don't set high expectations and then don't meet them. I think it's not in the WTO's interest for any headline around this ministerial to use the word fail or not to have lived up to where it needs to be. And so I think that's why the United States has kind of put forward what it calls a targeted approach, calling for a successful conclusion to the fishery subsidies negotiations, but also calling for some kind of modest institutional reforms with respect to transparency, to dealing with the self-declaration LDC issue, developing country issue, and other institutional reforms. So let me stop there. I think there's a lot more to talk about, but hopefully I've touched some of the issues that will be subject to our conversation this evening.
Okay, great. Thanks, Wendy. I think you have highlighted, of course, the importance of the WTO. I think that I'm very glad to see that Biden administration is now back to WTO, which you have illustrated, and also a quick approval of DJ since Biden took office. And also we see the DJ has also appointed 4 deputy DJ, and then we have one from US, one from China, one from EU, and so it's quite well represented now. I agree that we should really focus on the future of the WTO, because I think this pandemic is really we need world trade to reboot the global economy, particularly given the history, in previous time, the Second World War, all those financial crises. We need always international trade has been a big boost to the stability and global economy growth. So Pascal, you are the guru on WTO. You are the longest serving WTO DJ, and you know EU, China, and EU also a strong supporter of the multilateral system. I mean, US, as Trump has backed off for a while. Hopefully now Biden is coming again, but EU has been always there. China is also a strong supporter of a multilateral system now also. So what's your assessment? I mean, also, can all the major players play some more roles to shape the revival of the WTO to gain the confidence? I mean, after Doha round, we haven't really achieved anything. So what's your take on this? I mean, your opinion obviously is widely watched, and also that impact on the globalization and also recovery of global economy.
Okay, I'll try to answer your question, Henry, and let me also thank you for inviting me together with Wendy for this conversation. Short term, I think the main issue for us all remains to exit this pandemic, sanitary-wise, economy-wise, policy-wise, and this is not mostly a trade issue, although open trade and boosting trade can help a lot to boost the necessary recovery. there are a few issues that have to do with vaccine production, intellectual property, vaccine distribution, but this is not central to the multilateral trading system. If we look back at the sort of a big cockpit view, why do we need a multilateral trading system? Why do we need a World Trade Organization? Basically, to reduce obstacle to trade. Insofar as we believe, and a lot of us believe this, that opening trade is a good thing overall, hence reducing obstacle to trade that prevent trade to be more open is what needs to be done generally. Now, this is the big principle which necessitates immediately a bit of a qualification, which is why I totally agree with what Wendy said about the US trade policy or the EU trade policy or the China trade policy being very much a domestic issue. And the reason why it is a domestic issue is that if opening trade works overall to create efficiencies, if the sum of wins and losers is positive globally because efficiencies are higher, hence growth higher, this is usually not true locally. And the question of what is the real impact in a country of trade opening on profession X, worker Y, consumer Z is something which is much more complex than the big picture. In other words, while opening trade is a global issue and hence necessitates a multilateral trading system, a lot of attention has to be taken locally in how you manage the distribution between winners and losers. Winners can be much more many than losers globally, but this may not be true locally. And the reality is that in the West, there has been, for the last 10 or 15 years, more debate about whether or not this winner-loser equation has been taken right. And this explains why trade policy is very much a domestic policy. I remember when I was DG of WTO asking a minister if she could do this or that, and the answer was, come on, you're asking me to negotiate with myself. And my answer was precisely, this is exactly what I'm asking you to do. I'm asking you to renegotiate with your own constituency, your mandate, so that you can move. So that's for the sort of general introduction. The reality is that we have a relatively open world trading system that has worked for the last decades. Trade is more open today than it was 10 years ago, and 10 years ago it was more open than 20 years ago, yet there remains a number of issues in terms of leveling the playing field, i.e. ensuring as much as possible a fair competition between producers so that the benefits of trade opening of competition can flow to the benefit of consumers. There are basically, in my view, now in the world of today, which is quite different from the world of yesterday, two major issues on the substance of what needs to be done multilaterally to level the playing field. One has to do with competition, and another has to do with how you handle precaution. Competition is about ensuring that producers compete on a fair ground, i.e., without trade distortions, which classically are quantitative restrictions, tariffs, and subsidies. Quantitative restrictions and tariffs are, in today's world, not a major issue. They've been dealt with in the past, whereas subsidies, and notably because of where China is in the world economy, remain a problem. And I think the main issue for the multilateral trading system and for the WTO, as far as leveling the playing field is concerned, is what the Chinese leadership calls competitive neutrality. The reality is that China is a different economic political organization than the rest of the world, which is organized around globally liberal market capitalism. The reality is that China remains a communist country whose view is that holding 30% of the production system in the hands of the party, of the state, is the right way to go. This is very different from the rest of the world, and it's probably more different now, at least for the last 10 years, than it had been in the 10 previous years after China joined the World Trade Organization. So competitive neutrality, how to ensure that competing on the Chinese domestic market and on the international market with state-owned enterprises who are state-owned because they need the state support to what the Chinese leadership attributes to the benefits of this vast state-owned sector is an issue which, of course, many other countries have now to deal with. EU, US are probably more outspoken than others in the fact that they see this problem with competing with state-owned enterprises as an issue, and then that necessitates further adjustment of the rules of WTO as far as subsidization is concerned. But there are many other countries that have the same view. So as far as the purpose of organizing a level playing field fair system is concerned, I think the issue number one is to strengthen WTO rules on state aid. This is not the only issue. Another one, which is more recent, has to do with what I call precaution. Precaution is when you protect your people from risks, whereas protection is when you protect your producers from foreign competition. Precaution is now raising. It's about environment, it's about health, it's about safety, it's about security, it's about privacy. And this leads to a more fragmented, a more important part of regulation in the economy, and a regulation that is more fragmented, given that the way you protect your people from risks is very often correlated with ideology, with culture, with religion, with history. And this is, I think, a major issue for the future. So this is what I see as the two main issues. Plus, and I'll finish this introduction to our discussion with an issue which is quite dear to my heart, which unfortunately, in my view, does not get the level of attention which it should from countries' negotiations and trade negotiators, which is the WTO itself as a process. I think the way the organization works needs a lot more attention, needs a lot of reform, because contrary to less a priori modern organization, the WTO as a machinery to legislate, regulate globally is not what it should be for a number of reasons, which I think needs to be addressed. I won't expand on that, but I deeply believe that the machine room needs attention if we want the WTO to be able to be up to its task in the future. Over to you, Henry.
Okay, great. Thank you, Pascal. Yeah, I think both you and Wendy has actually, outlined your perspective on the WTO reform, and of course also you mentioned about the future, roles and the shaping the WTO. But also mentioned about China as well. I think that China actually, we just had recently, about last month, we organized the event, discussion about China joining the WTO for the 20th anniversary. We had a formal China WTO chief negotiator, Minister Long Yong-tu, and also we had former Vice Minister, the DDJ of WTO, Minister Yi Xiaozhun. Many other experts came and to CCG talked about that. What I think actually, for the WTO, which are, of course, trade has been greatly benefit China, but also the world. Like China, since China joined WTO, China's export to the world has increased 7 times, but China's buy-in to the world has increased 6 times also, and even more so on the service trade. So I think it's really multi-party win situation, whereas China's trade with developing countries has increased hugely, but also that China has contributed to 1/3 of the global GDP growth now. So I think the system, I agree with both of you said, this reform, this policy, it's also related with its domestic policy as well. China has been, lifted 800 million people out of poverty and representing 70% of the cutting of the global poverty, 10 years ahead of the SDG agenda on poverty alleviation. So it shows that, the system probably in China also works for itself. Like Pascal mentioned about there's a SOE portion of that, but for any disaster relief, for lifting poverty and all those, the SOE has to be in the front and has to deliver many social responsibilities. So I think, this hybrid system that China has seems working for itself. But of course, I think you raised a very good point about competitive neutrality. I think that is also a concept that is being widely discussed in China as well. I think could be room for the future improvement. Absolutely. I think that also, as Wendy knows well, that China also shows a great desire to join CPTPP now, which in that, Minister of Commerce has put forward the CPTPP agreement on ministry website. Here's the objective. Here's the standards that we need to look forward in the future. And then that's, I'm sure, Wendy, you helped to design many of that as well. So I think this is really a great discussion that we're having here. But what I want to raise another question is that I remember last year when we had this CCG webinar on multilateral trading system reform. Both you attended, and also including Alan Wolf, the then Deputy Director General of WTO, and quite a few other experts from China. We mentioned about WTO reform. There's a lack of leadership, and last year was really very obvious lack of leadership. But I think EU, China, but now US is back, and since WTO everything is on consensus, we need really strong leadership. So can really China, EU, and US, of course, to take really a great concerted efforts to really make WTO work. I mean, Wendy, you have written recently saying that maybe we could have a US, EU, China forum on the multilateral trade system. I think that is a great idea to pursue. But also, last time when we were discussing that, we were talking maybe Secretarial Office of WTO should play more role, like a WHO or many other organizations, where I think where member state probably is too many and too many roles that hard to make a decision. And also, thirdly, we really need some low-hanging fruit to conclude. Like this fishery subsidy discussion has been going on for so long. Maybe it's high time we conclude on that.